The band was still playing when I leaned across the cocktail table, put my hand on Derek's jaw, and kissed him on the cheek slow enough for the whole patio to notice. Glasses stopped clinking. Somewhere behind me, I heard my husband's chair scrape back against the stone tile, and for one glorious second I thought I had finally gotten a reaction out of him. Then Nathan stood up, raised his glass toward us, and said, loud enough for the whole engagement party to hear, "Congratulations, you two. Really. It's about time somebody made her feel like that again." Then he set his glass down on the linen tablecloth, buttoned his jacket, and walked straight through the garden gate without looking back. I stood there with my hand still hovering near Derek's face, waiting for the part where my husband got jealous. That part never came. What came instead took me 11 days to understand, and by the time I understood it, there was nothing left to salvage. I'm 36. My husband's name is Nathan, and for 9 years he had been the kind of steady that I mistook for boring the way you mistake a still lake for empty. He ran logistics for a mid-sized freight company, coached our nephew's baseball team on weekends, and never once forgot an anniversary, a birthday, or the name of anyone I introduced him to. People described him as easy to be around. I used to describe him, privately, as easy to overlook. That's the ugly truth I didn't say out loud until it was too late to matter. The party was for my college roommate Priya, celebrating her engagement at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, string lights strung between the trellises, a jazz trio playing under a tent, everyone a little drunk on good wine and the kind of nostalgia that makes old feelings feel new again. Derek was there because Priya had dated his cousin years ago and never dropped him from her circle. Derek was my ex from before Nathan, the one who used to write me songs on napkins and forget to pay rent, the one my mother still calls the good-looking disaster. I hadn't seen him in 6 years. He walked in wearing a linen shirt unbuttoned one notch too far, and something in me lit up that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Nathan noticed him before I did. He always noticed things before I gave him credit for. He didn't stiffen or grip his glass tighter. He just glanced over, said something polite to the man next to him, and kept eating his appetizer like Derek was any other guest. That composure irritated me more than jealousy would have. I wanted him rattled. I wanted proof that after 9 years of being taken for granted, he still cared enough to fight for me. So when Derek crossed the patio to say hello, I let the hug go 2 seconds longer than a hug between old friends should. I laughed at everything he said like it was the funniest thing anyone had ever told me. I touched his arm when the trio played a song Derek and I used to dance to in our 20s, and when he asked me to dance, I looked at Nathan first, the way you check a mirror before you do something reckless, and Nathan just watched me with that same unreadable calm I'd been mistaking for indifference for years. We danced. I let Derek spin me too close. I caught Nathan's eyes through the moving bodies and felt that little electric thrill of finally getting a reaction. When the song ended, I did something I hadn't planned, something that came out of pure performance more than desire. I leaned in and kissed Derek on the cheek, right there in front of 30 of our closest friends, right in front of my husband, timed perfectly so the whole patio would see it. Nathan stood up. And instead of the jealousy I'd been begging for all night, he gave a toast. To us. Congratulations, he said, like we'd just announced something worth celebrating. Then he walked out through the garden gate into the dark, and the band kept playing, and Priya's mother laughed nervously and asked if everything was all right, and I said everything was fine, everything was completely fine, while my stomach dropped through the floor of that vineyard like a trapdoor had opened underneath me. I told myself he'd cool off in the car. I told myself this was Nathan's version of a scene, the closest he'd ever come to making a fuss, and that by the time I got home he'd be waiting at the kitchen table wanting to talk it through like he always did. I stayed another 40 minutes because leaving right after him would have looked like guilt, and guilt was not a feeling I was ready to advertise. Derek bought me another glass of wine and told me I looked exactly like I did in college. I laughed at that too. I didn't think about what it cost. When I finally drove home a little after midnight, his truck was in the driveway, which felt like relief for exactly as long as it took me to open the front door. The house was too quiet in a specific way, the way a house sounds when someone has already decided something inside it. His shoes were by the door like always. His wedding ring was not on his hand when he came around the corner from the hallway. It was sitting in the little ceramic bowl by the light switch, placed there with a precision that told me it hadn't come off by accident. I asked him what he was doing. He said he'd been making sure our paperwork was in order. I asked what paperwork, and he nodded toward the kitchen island, where a stack of folders sat squared up at perfect right angles, the mortgage, our joint account statements, the deed to the house, a manila folder I didn't recognize with a printed label that just said timeline. I picked it up before I could stop myself. Inside were dates. Neat, small handwriting, a list going back almost 2 years. A holiday party where I'd introduced him as my other half, the responsible one, in a tone that made the whole table laugh at his expense. A weekend at the lake where I'd spent an entire dinner texting under the table with an old coworker while Nathan sat across from me trying to hold a conversation alone. A dozen smaller entries, comments I'd made in passing that I'd fully forgotten, the kind of remarks that feel like nothing in the moment and apparently accumulate into something enormous when somebody is quietly keeping score. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting steadier than I deserved, he'd written one line: "I kept waiting for a reason good enough to leave, and tonight she handed it to me in front of 30 people." I asked if he was seriously going to blow up our marriage over one kiss on the cheek. He said it was never about the kiss. He said the kiss was just the last page of a book he'd been reading for 2 years, and that he was tired of pretending he didn't know how the story ended. I told him he was being dramatic, that Derek meant nothing, that everyone kisses old friends on the cheek, that he was the one who'd made a scene by standing up and toasting us like a lunatic in front of everyone we knew. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face, some last flicker of hope I hadn't noticed was still burning, went out. "I toasted you," he said, "because I finally understood I wasn't going to win by getting angry. You wanted a fight. I decided not to give you one. I called that manipulative. I called it cruel, actually, standing in my own kitchen accusing the calmest man I'd ever known of cruelty, because it was easier than accusing myself of anything." He didn't argue. He picked up his keys, told me he'd be staying at his brother Colin's place for a few days, and said we'd talk when I was ready to talk without needing an audience to prove I was right. Then he left, and the door closing behind him was so quiet I almost didn't register that it was the loudest sound I'd hear all week. I woke up the next morning to 11 missed calls, all from people who'd been at the party, none of them from Nathan. Priya had texted a single line: "We need to talk about last night." Derek, unbelievably, had texted too, something breezy about how it was great seeing me and we should grab coffee sometime, like the entire evening had been a reunion instead of a detonation. I stared at that message longer than I want to admit, feeling the ugly little thrill of being wanted collide with the sick understanding of what that want had already cost me. By noon I'd convinced myself Nathan was punishing me, that this was some overblown power move meant to make me grovel, and that if I just gave it a day he'd come back apologizing for overreacting at Priya's party. Around 1, my sister Renee called. She'd been at the vineyard too. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if I understood what I'd done to him in front of all those people. I told her Nathan had been the one who made a spectacle of it, standing up and toasting us like that. She was quiet for a second, and then she said something that landed harder than I expected. Nathan didn't humiliate you last night. You humiliated him, and then you were furious that he found a way to survive it with his dignity intact. I hung up on her. I sat with that sentence for the rest of the afternoon like a stone lodged somewhere behind my ribs. That evening I drove to Colin's place, telling myself I just wanted to talk, though some smaller, more honest part of me wanted to see Nathan rattled, wanted proof that underneath all that composure there was still a man capable of begging me to come home. Colin answered the door and didn't step aside to let me in. He'd always been friendly with me, the kind of brother-in-law who remembered my coffee order and asked about my job, but that night his face had none of that warmth in it. I asked if Nathan was there. He said Nathan didn't want visitors. I told him I just needed 5 minutes. He said, "You had 9 years of minutes, Sabrina." He's done handing them out for free. I drove home shaking, not from grief yet, mostly from the strange vertigo of watching people who used to like me start treating me like a stranger who'd done something unforgivable. When I got back, Priya was waiting on my porch steps holding a bottle of wine like a peace offering. For one relieved second, I thought she'd come to take my side. She hadn't. She told me, gently but plainly, that half the engagement party had spent the drive home talking about what I'd done, not about her, not about the man she was going to marry, about me, about the calculated little performance I'd staged at her celebration to punish my husband for the crime of being steady. She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. I told her Nathan had overreacted by standing up like that. She looked at me the way you look at someone who genuinely doesn't understand what they've done yet, and said, "He didn't overreact, Sabrina. He congratulated you and left because he'd finally stopped waiting for you to notice him on your own." That night Nathan texted me exactly one sentence, "I'll come by Thursday for some of my things, please don't be there when I do." 9 years, and it had come down to logistics. I wrote 3 different replies and deleted all of them because each one sounded like a woman still trying to win an argument instead of a woman who understood she'd already lost something worth keeping. I finally sent, "I'll be there, we need to talk about this properly." His answer came a minute later, "You don't get to schedule the terms of this anymore." Thursday morning I made coffee out of habit, 2 mugs, his with the chip on the rim, mine with the lipstick stain that never fully scrubbed out, and I stood in the kitchen waiting for a version of this day that was never going to happen. He knocked instead of using his key, which told me everything before he said a word. Colin was with him, and there was a rented van parked at the curb. I asked why he'd brought help like this was some kind of ambush. He said he lived there too, technically, until the paperwork said otherwise, and that he needed hands to move faster than a conversation with me would allow. I followed him from room to room, apologizing in the specific, over-explaining way people do when they're trying to argue their way back into being forgiven instead of actually earning it. I told him I'd been drunk, that Derek meant nothing, that it was a stupid, thoughtless 5 seconds that didn't deserve to end a marriage. He kept folding his shirts into a box with a kind of patient, devastating calm. "You weren't drunk enough to lose control," he said. "You were drunk enough to finally say out loud what you'd been performing sober for 2 years." I had no answer for that, so I reached for the only weapon I had left and told him he was being cold, that the old Nathan would never have walked away from me like this. He looked up at that, and for the first time all week something like real anger moved across his face. "The old Nathan spent years hoping you'd eventually see him without needing another man in the room to make you look," he said. "This is what happens when he finally stops hoping." He didn't take anything that wasn't his. That was almost harder to watch than if he'd torn the place apart out of spite. The cast iron pan his mother gave us. The tool bench in the garage he'd built with his own hands the year we bought the house. The framed photo from our honeymoon in the hallway, which he lifted off the wall and held against his chest for a second before setting it carefully in a box, like it was something fragile he was finally allowed to protect again. At the door, with the last box balanced on his hip, I asked him outright if this meant divorce. He set the box down on the porch and looked at me with an exhaustion that had nothing dramatic left in it. "I'm not doing anything to you, Sabrina," he said. "I'm just done volunteering to be the background of your life so you can shine in front of people who used to make you feel wanted. I congratulated you at that party because I finally understood I couldn't compete with a feeling. I could only leave room for it." Then he picked the box back up, and Colin held the door, and the van pulled away from the curb while I stood in the doorway of a house that suddenly sounded far too large for one person. The week after felt like watching my own life get quietly repossessed. The joint accounts got separated into notices I had to read twice to understand. The calendar on the fridge, full of his tidy handwriting, dentist appointments, and his mother's birthday, and the reminder to renew my car registration that I would have absolutely forgotten without him, stayed frozen on a month that had already passed, because nobody was updating it anymore. Derek texted twice more, breezy, oblivious, entirely unaware that he'd been nothing more than a prop in a scene I'd staged for an audience of one. I didn't answer either message. For the first time in longer than I want to admit, the attention that used to feel like oxygen just felt like static. 10 days after the party, a courier delivered an envelope with my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a separation agreement drawn up by a lawyer I'd never heard Nathan mention, which told me he'd started making calls long before that night at the vineyard, that the kiss on the cheek hadn't broken anything so much as it had finally given him permission to stop repairing what I kept quietly cracking. I sat on the kitchen floor with those papers in my lap and did the thing I should have done the moment he stood up and raised his glass to congratulate me. I stopped defending myself long enough to actually listen to what I'd done. I called my sister back that night, and for once I didn't lead with my own hurt. I asked her, honestly, if she thought I'd always done this, made him small so I could feel seen, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said that she'd watched me do it for years and had simply hoped I'd notice on my own before it cost me everything. I asked what I was supposed to do now. She said the only honest thing left to do was stop performing remorse for an audience and start actually becoming someone worth trusting again, whether or not Nathan ever came back to find out. He didn't come back. We met once more, weeks later, at a coffee shop near his brother's place, neutral ground, his choice. He looked lighter than I'd seen him look in years, the particular lightness of someone who has finally put down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't just part of him. I told him I understood now, that the kiss had never really been about Derek, that it had been about spending 2 years testing how far I could push before he finally reacted, and that I was ashamed of how long it took me to see that testing someone's patience isn't the same thing as loving them. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished he said the thing that finally taught me what his toast at the party had actually meant. "I congratulated you because some part of me had already grieved us by then," he said. I wasn't angry that night. I was relieved. You'd finally given me a reason simple enough that I didn't have to keep inventing forgiveness out of nothing. We signed the papers 3 weeks after that. There was no shouting in the parking lot, no dramatic last plea, just 2 people who used to build a whole life out of Sunday mornings and shared grocery lists, standing 6 feet apart under fluorescent lighting, being polite to each other in the specific, careful way you're polite to someone you loved and ruined. He shook my hand before he left. My husband of 9 years gave me a handshake, and I stood there and let him, because I finally understood I hadn't earned anything softer than that. I saw him a few months later at a hardware store, of all places, laughing at something on his phone, looking like a man who'd remembered how to take up space in his own life again. I stayed by the paint samples with my hand on the cart, and for the first time in this whole ugly story, I loved him enough not to walk over and make him look up. So tell me honestly, would you have done what Nathan did, congratulated her and walked out with your dignity instead of making a scene? Or would you have stayed and fought for it in the moment? Would that toast have felt like the coldest thing a husband could do, or the strongest? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in his place, and if this story got under your skin at all, stay for the next one, because it only gets messier from here.